The title of this talk is Entrepreneurship in the Market Process, and I'd like to emphasize something from the very beginning. I'm going to be talking at a very elementary level, and many of you may feel insulted by the elementary level of this discussion, and I apologize for that, but on the other hand, I'm convinced that it's important to understand the most sophisticated levels of Austrian economics to get the foundations clearly stated at the foundational level. So without further apology, I'm going to be talking as if you were high school students who had never heard of any economics. And I apologize for any implied disrespect, which is not meant at all. Now, we've been talking about economic law, economic causation. The idea is that there are systematic chains of causation in the economic sphere. And at first glance, this is counterintuitive. And this is the reason why economics in general is really counterintuitive. Because when you think of it, as I mentioned this morning, you've got a lot of people, each doing their own thing, each free to do whatever they want, and you're supposed to get constraints. You're supposed to get systematic chains of cause and effect. Now, a chain of cause and effect means that if I pick up something and drop it, it's going to go one way, not the other way. Okay. Now, what is it? Now, what constrains this watch from flying up to the ceiling is the law of gravity. Okay. Now, what constrains individual activity such that you can argue for the existence of systematic chains of cause and effect. The fundamental message of economics is that there are systematic chains of cause and effect. And the question is, how can that possibly be? After all, market participants are unconstrained. So there is a standard approach and there will be an Austrian approach. The standard approach is that individuals are constrained. We are constrained by what other people do. And that makes a lot of sense. That's true. We are constrained by what other people do. Not only are we constrained by what other people do, in the sense that if you've sat on that chair, somebody else can't sit on that chair, okay? So you're constrained to look for another chair, okay? That's true, that's straightforward. But you're also constrained by what your expectations of what other people are going to do. And that's true as well. You are constrained by what you think other people are going to pay for that chair if you sit down on it, and so on. You don't go through the red light because you are constrained. You're constrained not merely because there's a policeman with a gun who's going to shoot you if you go through the red light, but because there is a certain percentage likelihood that you may be found guilty and have to pay a fine. So that constrains your actions. So I have no quarrel with that basic insight that individuals are constrained. But how does that generate systematic chains of cause and effect in the economic sphere? Well, the standard approach is that if you take everybody's actions and recognize that all those actions have to fit in with each other. In other words, if you sit there, somebody's got to sit someplace else. If B sits on that chair, then C's got to sit on the third chair. And if you recognize that, then you recognize that sooner or later, all of these activities are mutually constraining. They are mutually determining. And that is the approach of the standard approach of mainstream economics. And it's a brilliant insight that it is possible to demarcate the particular configuration that would permit all of these mutually constraining activities to take place simultaneously or over some chronological period. That's a fundamental insight. That is, of course, the insight of Walrasian equilibrium theory. It was a powerful insight, a profound insight. From this perspective, everybody's actions are constrained by everybody else's actions. If there's anybody whose actions are not constrained, that's going to throw a monkey wrench into this analysis. So in order for this for this system to work, in order for us to be able to say consistently that everybody's actions are are constrained by everybody else's actions, you've got to leave out the possibility of any so-called unconstrained activities, which means that you have to leave out the entrepreneur. Because the entrepreneur, by definition, and no matter how you define it, is someone who acts in a way which is not directly constrained with what other people do. He's breaking through into a new product, he's breaking through into a new market, he's acting in a way which is inconsistent with what other people expect people to do. So in order to sustain the Walrasian, or if you want, mainstream vision of an economic system, it's necessary to eliminate the entrepreneur. As I sometimes put it, the entrepreneur is an analytical pest, like roaches and rats. He's got to be eliminated for civilized living. So for civilized economic understanding, it's necessary to filter out all entrepreneurial activity. And this, when you think about it, this is a rather curious way of understanding the market economy. You're understanding the market economy by deliberately extruding, by deliberately leaving out the agency which everybody understands is what drives markets. Everybody understands that what keeps markets moving is entrepreneurial activity. If the only way you can understand it is by leaving out entrepreneurial activity, there's something wrong. The Austrian approach is that there are systematic processes which not only do not require the elimination of the entrepreneur, but to the contrary, they require the presence of the entrepreneur. In fact, the systematic processes depend on the entrepreneur, and they are generated by the entrepreneur. This is the general core of the Austrian approach, certainly the Misesian approach. Now, the role of the entrepreneur in the market economy as compared to the role of agents in a Walrasian economy, the comparison between them has a parallel. And that parallel is between the activities of the standard decision maker in mainstream microeconomics and the action of the human agent in Misesian economics. As you know, Mises's magnum opus is the human action. It was a powerful statement. Calling his book Human Action focuses attention on the fundamental difference between his economics and mainstream economics. Mainstream economics deals with the constrained maximizer. The constrained maximizer, the Robinsian decision maker who is confronted with a series of alternatives. He's got a given set of goals that he wants to achieve, and it's a mathematical problem how to achieve those goals in the best possible way, given the constraints of the resources that he has at his disposal. This is the standard decision maker in microeconomics, the constrained maximizer. For Mises, on the other hand, the unit of decision making is the human actor. And I sometimes like to illustrate the meaning of the Misesian actor, human actor, as distinct from the constrained maximizer, by imagining that there's a room with a little label outside. Notice outside says, "This is the decision-making room. You want to make your decisions, this is the place to come. You come here and you can make your decisions here." Okay? So you knock on the door, got to make a decision. What is your decision? Well, you have to decide whether you're going to get married or not, whether to go to medical school, whether I should join the National Guard. Okay? You got a decision to make. Well, you knock on the door and you tell them you want to make some decisions. Fine, this is the place to make decisions. But you know what? Tell us your objectives. Give us a complete listing, your objective function. Give us a complete listing of the various goals that you are interested in. with the order of their precedence in your preference ranking. Give us a list of all your constraints, and then you can go and have a cup of coffee and come back in 10 minutes and we'll tell you what you have decided. That's the decision-making room. That captures the meaning of constrained maximization. It's a mathematical problem. If you know what it is you want in terms of the different degrees of urgency of your needs, and if you know exactly what you have available to you, then the decision is a mechanical one. It is a mathematical one. It is a constrained maximization exercise. So you don't have to stay up at nights agonizing whether you're going to get married or not. You simply feed in the information and come back in 10 minutes after you had a cup of coffee, and you will know what you have decided. Well, that obviously is not quite satisfactory. It doesn't quite capture the agonizing that we do when we have to make decisions in life. And this, I think, this gives us a picture of the difference between a real decision, human decision. It was George Shackle who emphasized how far away the standard decision-making theory of microeconomics, how far away that theory is from the way in which human beings make decisions. And that's completely consistent with the meaning of Misesian action as opposed to what I call the Robbinsian economizer. When I use the term Robbinsian economizer, I don't want to in any way to disparage the work of Lionel Robbins. I used to incur the displeasure of my revered colleague Ludwig Lachmann, who used to be very upset when I used to talk in these terms. He used to deny vehemently that Robbins had this view of the economic decision. And I can only throw up my hands. Please read Robbins. If it's not Robbins, then whoever wrote the latest version of mainstream microeconomics, I'll substitute his name or her name. But I still call it the Robbinsian economizer because that's the way I read Robbins of 1932. In fact, it was Robbins' book that, as I mentioned earlier, that in fact inspired the way in which late 20th century microeconomics developed. So it's the difference between the Robbinsian decision maker and the human agent that puts the finger on the entrepreneurial element. There is an entrepreneurial element in human action. In other words, when you're deciding whether or not to get married, when you're deciding whether or not to go to medical school or which medical school to go to, when you're making that decision, you are making an entrepreneurial decision. You're deciding at that point whether you think people are going to need doctors in the years to come. You're going to have to make anticipations as to whether or not you think medicine is going to be completely socialized or not in the years to come. You're going to have to make decisions based on your estimates as to whether you can make it through medical school. You're going to have to make all those decisions. These are imponderables, unknowns. These are prediction issues of prediction, and that's what decision making is all about. That's why people stay up at night agonizing over decisions, because you cannot simply make a decision based on the mathematics. It's the decision includes determining what the functions are which you have to feed into your computer. That's the entrepreneurial element, okay? Now, I think to illustrate how the entrepreneurship in this sense relates to the market process, I think perhaps a useful way of doing it, of achieving this, will be for me to recall a statement made orally by Hayek. He made it at New York University back in the early 60s. Was it the late 50s or early 60s? I heard him, he made a sort of off-the-cuff remark. He said, the most fundamental law of economics is the law of single price. That there is a law that you can't have two prices for the same item. He quickly added on, of course this is a tendency. What did he mean by adding that on? He said, well, he's not denying that you could have two prices for the same item. All he's saying is that the fundamental law of economics is that there is a tendency for the prices of a single item to converge to a single price throughout the market. And he said this is the most fundamental, I don't remember, he feels it's the most powerful, most fundamental, most far-reaching law in economics. And he was absolutely right. And I'd like to illustrate the idea of an entrepreneurial process by focusing on this law. And as I say, this is very elementary, but I think it can be instructive. Imagine that potatoes can be had for 10 at the bottom of the hill here in Irvington, and they can be had at 20 at the top of the hill. Okay? Does that violate the law of Hayek's, the Hayek's law? We call it Hayek's law. It doesn't violate the law because, well, first of all, Hayek said it's only a tendency. Okay, is there a tendency for the price of the potatoes at the bottom of the hill to equal the price of the potatoes at the top of the hill? Well, you'll say not really, because it may cost some transportation costs to lug up a sack of potatoes from the bottom of the hill to the top of the hill, especially on a hot day like today. You've got to pay somebody to lug those potatoes up. Well, when you take into account the cost of transportation, okay, the cost of the potatoes at the bottom of the hill plus the cost of transportation will give you the exact price of the potatoes at the top of the hill, or if they don't, there'll be a tendency that will make them the same. Okay? Okay, that sounds reasonable. Sounds reasonable. Let's go a little bit further. Supposing the reason why the cost of potatoes at the bottom of the hill is less than the price of potatoes at the top of the hill, supposing the reason for that, besides transportation, supposing you include transportation costs, the cost of bringing up potatoes to the top of the hill from the bottom of the hill is such that the total price of the potatoes as having been bought from the bottom of the hill is still lower than the price of the potatoes at the top of the hill, right? Supposing that were the case, well, you say there are powerful forces that are going to make these meet the same. Either that means that the price of transportation is going to rise, the price of the potatoes is going to rise, or the price of potatoes at the top of the hill is going to fall. Something is going to happen to cause the prices to converge. Okay? Supposing now that the reason for the discrepancy is not transportation costs, you've taken account of that, but there's an absence of information. There's an absence of information. Because at first glance, I'm speaking to high school kids, so please forgive me. At first glance, it's just impossible for the price to be different. It's ridiculous to say the price is going to be different at the bottom of the hill from the top of the hill. Why would anybody pay a high price at the top of the hill if you could get potatoes at a lower price at the bottom of the hill? Okay? Why would anybody sell at the bottom of the hill for a price when you could get a higher price at the top of the hill, including transportation costs? Okay? It's ridiculous, right? So it can't be. Obviously, the price must be the same. Well, we know that's not true. Why is it not true? Because there may be an absence of information, right? Okay. We understand that. We're all high school kids. We understand that there's such a thing as an absence of information. You don't know the answer to the examination question. We understand that. There is such a thing as ignorance. Yes. So, there's a price. Isn't there a price to pay for information? Isn't there a price to pay for information? In other words, cannot information be obtained at a price? If information can be obtained at a price, then it would seem that the cost of information is not that much different from the cost of transportation. If all you need to make sure that you've correctly incorporated all the costs necessary to make the potatoes comparable, you've included the cost of lugging up the sack of potatoes to the top of the hill, if you included that, then why can't you do that with information? Why can't you say, well, it costs information, there are costs involved in transmitting information, in looking up information, in calling up people, say, what's the price of the potatoes at the top of the hill? And what's the price of the potatoes at the bottom of the hill? It costs telephone costs, it costs the communication costs. Put them into the equation, everything should work out right? Everything should work out that there should be an immediate tendency for the prices to be to be the same, including the cost of information. And indeed, this is the neoclassical view of information cost. George Stigler, eminent Chicago School economist, developed the economics of information, where in fact, information is purchased to the extent that it's worthwhile, which means that the amount of information necessary to make the two prices the same will be paid unless the cost of information doesn't make it worthwhile. Supposing it costs $300 to lug up a sack of potatoes from the bottom of the hill, the prices will be different. And there's no problem with the law of price because these are different potatoes, right? The cost of the potatoes at the bottom of the hill is not the same as potatoes at the top of the hill. Potatoes at the top of the hill require the expenditure of $300 to lug them up. So if the cost of information is going to be such that it doesn't pay to get the information, then the information will not be purchased, the information will not be produced, it will not be purchased, and the price will be different. But that doesn't violate the law of the single price, because you're not able to translate the potatoes at the bottom of the hill to the corresponding potatoes at the top of the hill, because you don't have the information, and the cost of providing the information is so great that it doesn't pay. Which means that in effect the prices are really all the same, prices of the same item. In other words, where you could translate one form of the item into another form of the item are always going to be the same. But we know that they're not the same. That's the crucial point. We know that they're not the same. See, the economics of information misses the point that you've got to know what information you're going to need, and you've got to know the price of that information in order to make this theory of information work. But in fact, one of the absolute unknowns is the cost of information, not just the cost of information. One of the fundamental unknowns is the need for information. If there is a wall separating from the bottom of the hill to the top of the hill, there is no way in which people might realize that for a cost you could find out whether there are potatoes with a different price at the top of the hill. You don't know that there's anything to discover. Most of our ignorance, and believe me, I'm including myself, most of our ignorance is in the form of not knowing what it is that we don't know. Right? That's most of our ignorance. Some of our ignorance is rational ignorance. That means I take a look at the book, How to Speak Sanskrit. And I thumb through the book and I decide I'm not going to learn Sanskrit. I have made a conscious decision to be ignorant. I love ignorance. What does that mean, I love ignorance? That means that the value of the knowledge of Sanskrit, I have evaluated it and determined that the cost of learning is too great, so that it pays for me, it's rational for me, it's efficient for me to remain ignorant. Efficient, optimal ignorance. We are high school students, right? Optimal ignorance, right? Optimal ignorance. But there is such a thing as suboptimal ignorance. And suboptimal ignorance takes what form? It takes the form of not knowing that for a small cost I could know what's necessary to make me very rich. That's a shame, right? Because it's inefficient. But it's a fact of life. We do not know what it is we do not know. We do not know the true cost of finding out what it is we do not know and finding out whether or not it's worthwhile knowing. We don't know that. That's where entrepreneurship comes in. The world is a world in which the decisions that we have to make are decisions that we make in ignorance, where ignorance means absolute ignorance. We don't know what it is that we might want to know. We don't know. Okay? So, the potatoes at the bottom of the hill, the potatoes at the top of the hill. There's a wall in between. And somebody wanders up and down the hill and notices. He notices the prices are here are 10, there's a price of 20. And he moves to make a profit. Okay? What does he do? He buys He buys, forget about transportation costs. He buys potatoes, including transportation costs, at 10 and sells the potatoes at 20. Makes a profit. As he does that, what does that tend to do to the price of potatoes at the bottom of the hill? Tends to increase them. What does it do to the price of potatoes at the top of the hill? Tends to depress them. In this way, the entrepreneurial activity, which is what he's engaged in, right? He grasps a profit opportunity, and the grasping of that profit opportunity generates a price convergence. That's Hayek's law, right? The fundamental law that there is a tendency. What is the nature of that tendency? It is an entrepreneurial process. There is a tendency for an entrepreneurial process to be generated that will tend to bring prices into line with each other. Notice how far-reaching this law is. When Hayek called it the fundamental law, I believe that was his phrase, fundamental, foundational. I don't remember the exact phrase that he used. But I think you'll agree when you think about it. It covers everything. Think about spices in India and in Europe. Right? Think about international trade. Think about intergenerational trade. Think about production in its most complex forms, where an entrepreneur buys resources at 10 and sells cars at 20. Okay? All of that are examples of Hayek's foundational law. There is a tendency for prices to tend to equality. Because if the resource can be had for 10, I like to talk about oranges. If you take oranges at 10 and turn them into orange juice at 20, then oranges plus the squeezing activity for 10 and sell the orange juice for 20, well, you have found an entrepreneurial opportunity, and that tends to bring the prices together until there's no longer any pure profit to be obtained by engaging in that entrepreneurial activity. This is a far-reaching law. All examples of entrepreneurial activity throughout the market are examples of Hayek's fundamental law. Notice there is an exquisite fascination that I can never get over. That is that the circumstance that leads to the discovery that there's more than one price, and the circumstance that inspires action to eliminate that price discrepancy, the circumstance is that the price discrepancy constitutes an opportunity for pure profit. Just grasp that for a moment. It is a mind-boggling insight that the mistakes are responsible for the lure to correct those mistakes. It is a marvelous, I can't think of any other term. Hayek once talked about the marvel of the market. This is the marvel of the market. What is the marvel of the market is that the mistakes, the initial mistakes that were responsible for the price of potatoes being different in one part of the country than another, or the fact that resources were not being used to produce the products that could be produced, the circumstance that inspires discovery of these mistakes, and the circumstance that inspires the exploitation and correction of these mistakes is the circumstance that a mistake constitutes an opportunity for pure profit. If you can buy at 10 and sell at 20, that is ice cream. That lures you. That gets your attention. It gets your attention. What gets your attention is the direct consequence of the mistake that had been made. Notice that the mistake was a tragic mistake. Tragic. Why was it tragic? Well, if the price of potatoes down there was 10, and the price of potatoes up here was 20, there are presumably people up here that would be glad to buy potatoes at 15, and they couldn't get it. They went hungry. They starved to death. They starved to death. And there were people down there that starved to death. You know why? Because they had potatoes that they weren't able to sell at 10. They were happy to sell at 10, but there was nobody buying, so they had to. So there's a tragedy here. The people who had potatoes at 10, they would have been delighted to sell at 15. The people who couldn't pay 20 would have been delighted to pay 15. It's a tragedy when the ships pass in the night and they don't see each other. It is a shame, a societal shame. And this is corrected how? How is this corrected? This is corrected by entrepreneurial discovery. By entrepreneurial discovery. This is the basic meaning of entrepreneurship. Now, I repeat, in neoclassical economics, there is no such thing as pure profit. It doesn't exist. In neoclassical economics, which is equilibrium economics, the word profit does not exist. Now, you may say that's not true because you went through the theory of the firm and the diagrams that you were taught told you were maximizing profit. And they were even given little squares or little rectangles that showed on the diagram how you were maximizing profit, and you used calculus to calculate exactly how decisions will be made in order to maximize profit. But that's not true. That's not pure profit. It's not the profit in the true sense of the word profit. If anything, that profit was simply quasi-rent attributable to a fixed plant. That, in other words, in the short run, there may be gravy to be gotten from a plant, but that's quasi-rent. In fact, the value of the plant will have been bid up already in the classical economics to capture that, so that the profit is simply the so-called profit is simply quasi-rent at the going rate of interest, going equilibrium rate of interest on the capital the capital that's the newly calculated capital that is constituted by that fixed plant. There is no pure profit in neoclassical economics. There cannot be, because everybody knows everything. If everybody knows everything, that means prices are already equal. What Hayek called a tendency in neoclassical economics is not a tendency, it is an achieved result. Prices are already equal. There is no profit. There cannot be profit because prices are already fully equated throughout the system. But for Austrian economics, pure profit is a fact of life. It signifies that at any given time, there are mistakes being made. At any given time, there are discoveries to be made. The world is full of profit opportunities at all times. What keeps the market in motion, what keeps the market process working, is the continual discovery by entrepreneurs of these profit opportunities. In grasping profit, the entrepreneur is correcting what we would call a wasteful arrangement. The present arrangements are wasteful in the sense that there are potatoes down there at a lower price, there are hungry consumers at the top of the hill willing to pay a higher price, and they're not getting it. I'd like to point out a remarkable circumstance. And this circumstance is that entrepreneurship is always competitive. Always competitive. Now let's just mull over that. What do we mean by competition? What do we mean by competition? Well, the textbooks have a chapter on competition. And if you read the textbook and you're boned up for the quiz on competition, you will find out that following Frank Knight's formulation, competition requires perfect knowledge. It requires an infinite number of buyers and sellers. It requires that no buyer and seller can affect the price. And it requires that the product be homogeneous throughout the system. If you've got those conditions fulfilled, you have perfect competition. If you don't have them, well, you may have imperfect competition, you may have sort of 80% competition, whatever that means, but you don't have perfect competition. We want perfect competition. Why do we want perfect competition? Because perfect competition is the only type of competition that's consistent with our fundamental premises, namely that we're always in equilibrium. That's the fundamental reason why perfect competition has captured the headlines in our elementary textbooks. But that's not the competition that we know. That's not the competition that you grew up with. That's not the competition that your parents told you. You better shape up because it's a competitive world out there. That's what they told you, and they were dead right. It is a competitive world out there, not a world in perfect competition, let me emphasize. It's a competitive world out there. In what sense is there a competitive world out there? Well, it's a world out there where everybody is trying to outstrip each other. They are trying to outstrip each other. In perfect competition, there's no point in trying to outstrip each other. In perfect competition, everybody knows everything. In perfect competition, you've defined the system that no buyer and seller can affect the price. So you can't get ahead by cutting price. You can't get ahead by improving quality, because if you've improved quality, you have violated the condition that the product is homogeneous. You've violated the rules of the game. The rules of the game are that everybody knows everything, everybody's charging the same price, everybody's selling the same product, everybody knows everything. There's no way of competing. You cannot compete in perfect competition. It's sort of, I can never get over the really amazing use of language, or misuse of language, or abuse of language. The perfectly competitive model is called perfectly competitive. Okay? But that's the way it's used. But that's not the competition that we know, and that's not the competition that we're talking about when we claim that entrepreneurship is always competitive. What does competition really mean? What did your parents mean when they told you that there's a competitive world out there? What they told you is that there is something called freedom of entry. Freedom of entry. That means that if you're making a very nice, tidy profit, very comfortable profit, there's nothing to stop other people from coming into your market and beating your profit down by charging a lower price than you're charging. There's freedom of entry. If you're producing a product at a certain quality and you're making a nice, comfortable living, thank you, but there's nothing stopping somebody else from making an improved product, which will outsell your product because it's a better product for the same price. In other words, wherever you're making a comfortable profit, what is that profit? What is that profit? An invitation to somebody else to enter. Profit is an invitation for entry. With freedom of entry, with no institutional blockages against entry, you've got competition. That's freedom of entry. And that's what a dynamic market economy requires, nothing more. Nothing more. Over the history of the 20th century, we heard the brilliant lecture this morning by Professor White on the clashes of ideas in the 20th century. Some of the clashes of ideas had a lot to do with competition. It was maintained at certain times. We've got to maintain competition. And very often maintaining competition meant blocking competition, blocking entry. You got to keep everybody doing the same thing. If maintaining competition means making sure that nobody charges a price less than anybody else, that's not maintaining competition. That's blocking competition. That's blocking entry. If maintaining competition means preventing mergers because the merger firm might cut prices, that's not maintaining competition. That's blocking competition. That's blocking entry. Competition requires freedom of entry and nothing more. What does freedom of entry mean? No institutional blockage preventing anybody from using his or her own resources, including, of course, borrowed resources, to do what they believe can capture a profit. That's freedom of entry. And if there's freedom of entry, that keeps everybody on their toes. Because if you're an incumbent, but you know that other people are free to enter your industry, you are not going to overlook any opportunities for improving your profit. You're not going to overlook any opportunities for cutting your price. Because if you don't cut your price, you know that somebody else will enter. Now, does that mean to say that people never make profit? Because if you make profit, you're inviting other people. No, 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 no. It's precisely the competition is the grasping of pockets of profit. That's what competition means, grasping pockets of profit. It's the continual process of perceiving profits where other people have made mistakes or other people have not given the best possible service to consumers and taking advantage of those opportunities. The continual process of grasping profit opportunities is the competitive process. It is that process upon which the market depends for any efficiency that it is able to achieve. Freedom of entry. This is now entrepreneurship is always free. Entry is free. Let me just point that out. You see, if you're making orange juice, it is conceivable that you can capture all the orange groves. You may try and establish complete control over all the orange groves. If you own all the oranges, nobody can compete with you. Well, just 1 minute. Can anybody still produce grapefruit juice? Oh yeah, but I've got a monopoly of orange juice. Well, that's true. But grapefruit juice is a fairly good competitive beverage to orange juice. And if you've got the grapefruits too, if you've got the grapefruit groves tied up as well, well, there's such a thing as apple juice. There's such a thing as bottled water. There's many other things to do. And if you've got the whole beverage industry bottled up, in more ways than one, okay, then there are other things. There are innumerable products. If all the beverages are going to be monopolized, people will find other ways in which to satisfy their thirst. Okay? In other words, any one commodity is a competitive commodity for everything else. The idea that you're talking about a single homogeneous commodity, okay, is artificial, is very artificial. It's so artificial that the equilibrium theorists themselves began to realize how unworkable it was, and that's what generated in the 30s and 40s Edward Chamberlain's theory of monopolistic competition, which was a way of having the best of both worlds, recognizing that there's more than one variety of product and yet staying within an equilibrium theoretic context. The fundamental idea is that all entrepreneurship is competitive, because to be an entrepreneur you don't need any resources. Nobody can monopolize all the resources for entrepreneurship, because there are no resources necessary for entrepreneurship. You may say, well, is that true? Don't you need eyes? Don't you need ears? Don't you need a telephone? Well, yes, there's a market for telephones, there's a market for ears, and a market for eyes. To see, we're talking about see in quotation marks. You have to see that there are possibilities of hiring researchers and hiring people who can work the telephones in such a way that it's going to be profitable. That's entrepreneurship. No resources are required for entrepreneurship itself. The entrepreneur requires resources. He buys resources. The entrepreneur buys resources and sells products. Those resources may involve research. The entrepreneur who hires the scientist to do the research, and the scientist discovers a technological breakthrough, a pharmaceutical breakthrough. Who is the entrepreneur? Not the scientist who made the breakthrough, but the employer who hired the scientist. The scientist wasn't an entrepreneur. He didn't have confidence that he's going to be profitable. That's why he sold his services for a fixed salary. Okay? In the Soviet Union, they recognized that you have to be innovative. So the planning authorities in the Soviet Union used to set up people to make innovations. And that always reminded me of deans in colleges. Forgive me, I lived a sheltered life in academia. Okay, all my examples are from academia. And what I experienced was that from time to time, deans get the idea we've got to change their course content, got to change the course structure. You got to have new courses, because the old courses are old courses. You want new courses. So what did the faculty do? They take the old reading list and add a few items and switch things around so that so that session number 1 becomes session number 5. You switch things around. It's new. What's new is not necessarily better. What's new in a capitalist economy is only going to come into effect if it promises a profit. The fact that it's new doesn't mean it's profitable at all. Doesn't mean that it's better for consumers at all. Competition is entrepreneurial, and entrepreneurship is competitive. All competition is entrepreneurial. When anybody competes, that means he enters. When a person enters, he is making an entrepreneurial step. I can see profit opportunity, I'm moving to grasp it. That's an entrepreneurial step. That's competition. Competition is entrepreneurial. Entrepreneurship is competitive. So the market process is a process of mutual entrepreneurial discovery. That's what it is. It's a continual process of discovery. By the way, let me just add a footnote here. This is a footnote. I'm interrupting myself. I very often talk as if the only way in which an entrepreneur can act is a profitable way. I have news for you. Entrepreneurs make losses too. And I have properly been criticized for not always emphasizing that fact. I've sometimes made it seem to the reader that entrepreneurs always see profits and they make profits. An entrepreneur can think he sees a profit opportunity, and really it may be a loss, because your entrepreneurial activity is not choosing between givens that are here today. They are choosing between givens that are here today and givens that will be givens that will be given tomorrow, and you may not see them correctly. The entrepreneur may see losses. That's absolutely true, and I don't want to be misunderstood. There is a process of mutual discovery in which, when people make mistakes, they realize their mistakes. They can realize your mistake and make a correction, or you can realize your mistakes and realize that maybe you should be chopping wood rather than being an entrepreneur. People learn from their mistakes. Now, how does this relate to the standard theory of the market that is expressed in the good old Marshallian cross? Right? You got a supply curve and a demand curve, and in a competitive market, you ask the students, where is the price? And they say, this is the price. That's the quantity. That's the quantity, this is the price. How does all this relate to this diagram? Well, I think all of us, and I say all of us, I mean all of us teachers. We're all teachers. We're not high school students anymore. We're all teachers. We all teach economics, and we all teach the supply and demand diagram. I taught it too in my earlier career, okay? I taught this too. And I taught this in dynamic terms. I showed how this teaches us how price gravitates towards equilibrium. And the way you teach it is you say, supposing price is above equilibrium, right? Supposing this was the price. Well, you've got an excess supply over demand, excess quantity supplied over quantity demand. What does that tend to do to price? Forces it down, right? If you've got an excess supply, that forces price down. On the other hand, if price is below, you've got a shortage because the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. If there's a shortage, what does that do to price? Well, obviously, price goes up. So you've got a dynamic process in which the price is gravitating towards the equilibrium price, towards the price where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. I taught that, you taught that, we all taught that, and it's all wrong. It's all wrong. Not that there's no value in this. There is value in this, but it's not right. It's not right because when you analyze this supply curve and demand curve, you will realize that the conditions to be fulfilled by this diagram violate the possibility of disequilibrium. What do I mean by that? Well, how do you define a point? How do you define this point? This point, call it R. How do you define the point R? Well, the point R gives you the answer to the question. Supposing suppliers would know they can sell as much as they want at that price, P sub R. Okay, what quantity would they offer for sale? That gives you the answer. Okay, that's what it means. But to say that means that you are hypothetically assuming a demand curve going through there, so that at that price you can sell as much as you want. You're hypothetically assuming that. In fact, every point on the supply curve assumes a demand curve going through that point. Think about it. In fact, every point on the demand curve assumes that you've got a supply curve going through that point. That's what the points mean. The points have no meaning outside the equilibrium context. Not only is it nonsense to say, supposing there's a single price, there's a price at this level. How can there be a single price? What made it a single price? We said it's a tendency, didn't we? We didn't say that it's always true. The price, what do you mean the price is above equilibrium? What do you mean by the price? There are many prices. Okay? So obviously that you're begging the question when you talk about a single price. But even the idea you can imagine a single price being up there and they're drawing these curves, you are contradicting the basic premise of what a point means. I often point out, forgotten which economist once made the very cogent remark. He says, really, the only relevant portion of this diagram that makes any sense is this point. Really, what we should do is to draw a point and say, that's the supply and demand diagram. Except the people in the back of the room wouldn't see it, so you make it bigger. Right? Now, there's a profound truth in that way of putting it. Because what it means is that your diagram is really inconsistent with an open-ended situation in which you do not have perfectly a competitive equilibrium. This diagram, what this diagram means is that if you had a series of points defined the way we defined them, and if you had a series of points defined the way you have them, the only situation that is consistent would be that point, which means that's the only point of the diagram. That's all you have. Well, that's what equilibrium is. That's what equilibrium theory means. You are starting out with the assumption that you are at equilibrium. You start out with the assumption that you've got a single price. You start out with the assumption that there is no situation where any sometimes it's useful to think of this not in horizontal terms but in vertical terms. Take this quantity. Take this quantity J. Quantity J, two questions can be asked. What is the highest price that is low enough to get demanders to buy this quantity? The answer is up there. What is the lowest price that is high enough to get suppliers to offer this quantity? The answer will be there. Which means that there is a gap. There is a possible price that is higher than the prices that would be sufficiently high to get a producer to get producers to produce the commodity. It's that gap that invites entrepreneurial activity. By drawing this diagram and focusing on this, we are assuming that all entrepreneurial activity to eat up, to whittle away this price differential has been taken advantage of. Obviously, nothing is going to happen beyond this because the highest price that is sufficiently low to get demanders to buy is lower than the lowest price sufficiently high to get suppliers to offer it for sale. So obviously, that's not going to happen. So the presumption on the basis of which we draw this diagram locks us into the intersection price. And that's not the way markets operate. That's not. It's a very. Don't misunderstand me. I've taught that too. I taught that too, and I don't regret it. There's probably no tool in economics that's less useful than that. A very useful tool, but you are skipping the market process. If you want to get a short answer, what happens if there's a sudden increase in demand? That's the diagram to use. The demand curve will shift over to the right, the price goes up. But you haven't explained how the price goes up. For that, you need Austrian price theory. But again, Mises had no qualms about using this diagram. He didn't. You won't find it in Human Action. Not because he didn't think it was useful, but because it doesn't get to the essence of the market process. But it's a highly useful diagram, and Mises recognized that. If you want to teach students who know nothing about economics, not you anymore, you know everything about economics. I taught you, right? 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 If you want to teach people who know nothing about economics something in 1/2 hour that will be extremely valuable to their economic understanding, that's what you should teach them. So please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But that does not include that skips the essence of the market process itself. Let me try and sum up. There is an exquisite paradox that I think emerges from all of this. Remember what we said before, that for neoclassical economics, the entrepreneur is an analytical pest, like roaches and rats. The exquisite paradox that Austrian economics reveals is that what is responsible for order, what is responsible for systematic chains of cause and effect, is precisely that activity which had to be pushed out of mainstream economics, namely entrepreneurial activity. That's the exquisite paradox. It's not that you can reconcile entrepreneurship with economic order. You can't get any economic order. You cannot understand any economic order without bringing in the entrepreneur. That's the exquisite paradox that emerges from this discussion. We empirically, we see that the market works. We see that. As some people used to say, Paris gets fed. Paris, as Bastiat used to point out, every day requires enormous quantities of different kinds of foods. And miraculously, they're all here every day. Paris gets fed. How does it work? It works because of the entrepreneurial process. I mentioned this morning that I might, if there's time, I might say something about entrepreneurship and Schumpeter. Schumpeter, as we mentioned earlier, was an Austrian. That is, he was an Austrian-trained economist under Böhm-Bawerk, who, of course, was never part of the Mises Hayek version of Austrian economics. But he was responsible way back from 1911 all the way to his book in 1942, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. He was responsible for emphasizing the role of the entrepreneur. And he's very often been cited as an example, as a proponent of free markets. After all, if you recognize the advantages of entrepreneurship, which Schumpeter did, his entrepreneur was the fellow who comes in with a new idea. He comes in with a new product. He comes in with discovering a new market, a new technique. It's what keeps the market, the dynamism of the market is inspired by the entrepreneur. Okay? So it would seem that this provides a powerful argument for free markets. And it does. It does. Much more powerful than the argument of the Walrasians. You see, the Walrasians, the equilibrium theorists, they too are supposed to be in favor of the free market because in a perfectly competitive equilibrium, you can show that the result is Pareto optimal, which is great, wonderful. However, it's very easy for a critic of free markets to point out, A, you don't have perfect competition. Don't have perfect knowledge, you don't have infinite number of buyers and sellers, right? So the conditions are not fulfilled. And it's very easy for critics of the free market to point to things like externalities. It's very easy to find holes in the neoclassical mainstream equilibrium theory. But when you begin to talk about entrepreneurship, whether it's Schumpeterian entrepreneurship or what I would call Misesian entrepreneurship, then you've got a different argument. Then the argument for the free market is freedom of entry. Freedom of entry is what drives the market. Freedom of entry is what generates the efficiency and the discovery and the dynamism of the market. You've got a different argument. And I believe this is the fundamental and really truthful argument in favor of the free market. Without free markets, there is no guarantee whatsoever that mistakes will not be perpetuated. There's no guarantee whatsoever that mistakes will ever be discovered. There is no guarantee. There are two types of error. There are types of error where the error is such that you bump your head against the ceiling. Well, if you bump your head against the ceiling, you realize there's a ceiling there, and you don't do it again. But there could be also the type of mistake where you don't see that there's a lump of gold over there. If you didn't see yesterday that there was a lump of gold, what is going to guarantee that you're going to see it tomorrow? And the world is full of lumps of gold, technological lumps of gold, which we haven't seen. What inspires the discovery of those lumps of gold? The answer is the opportunity to make pure profit. That's what inspires them. And that is the basis for making the claim that entrepreneurship and the market process demonstrates not only what actually causes markets to work, but also why they present a powerful case for the free market. Thank you very much.